Questions orales. The Honourable Opposition House Leader.
Has already misled Canadians once when he said our allies were A-OK with us pulling out of the fight against ISIS. We know now that just wasn't true. It's clear he's doing it again when he says the U.S. was consulted and gave the green light to Canada selling defence technology to the Chinese. Will the Prime Minister just admit the U.S. was not happy about this sale, but he didn't care, so he approved it anyway?
Good. Honourable Minister of Innovation.
Mr. Speaker, we have enormous confidence in our national security agencies who do their work properly, who examine all the relevant facts, Mr. Speaker, who follow the process and make a thoughtful recommendation. They made a recommendation and we followed that recommendation and we followed their advice, Mr. Speaker. This is exactly the multi-step review process that exists under the Investment in Canada Act, Mr. Speaker. We never have and we never will compromise on national security.
Opposition House Leader.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister said that the U.S. had been consulted, but if they had been consulted, wouldn't our ambassador on the ground in Washington have known about it? He didn't seem to know about it, and now the Prime Minister has put our ambassador in a very difficult situation. Why is the Prime Minister so intent on appeasing China that he's willing to not only put the safety and security of Canadians at risk, but also jeopardize the important relationship we have with our closest ally, friend, and trading partner, the United States?
Honourable Minister of Innovation.
Mr. Speaker, we've been very clear that we have followed the process under the Investment in Canada Act, Mr. Speaker. All transactions are subject to a national security review. But more broadly, Mr. Speaker, we're focused on the economy and we're focused on investments coming to Canada. That is why in the first quarter we saw growth up by 3.7%, Mr. Speaker. That is why since we formed government, the unemployment rate has gone from 7.1% to 6.6%. That's 250,000 good quality full-time jobs over the past 6 months.
Well, Opposition House Leader.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister says he wants middle-class Canadians and those working hard to join them to pay even more for Internet services. We know the Liberals are proposing a 5% additional tax on everyone's Internet bill. Canadians are hoping that this is the Prime Minister's version of a very late April Fool's joke. Actually, Mr. Speaker, it's ridiculous. Will the Prime Minister commit today that he will not implement an Internet tax on hard-working Canadian families? Yes or no?
Minister of Canadian Heritage.
Mr. Speaker, let me be clear. Our government will not be introducing a tax on the Internet. Since we were elected, we lowered taxes for the middle class and increased them for the wealthiest 1% of Canadians. Canadians of all walks of life rely on Internet service for business and personal use, and we will not be introducing a tax on the Internet that would further burden them. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Richmond-Arthabaska. Mr. Speaker, so ultimately Canadians won't be getting a Netflix tax, they're going to be getting a streaming tax. We know that Liberals have lost control over public spending, and the only solutions they come up with are taxing Canadians even more. Mr. Speaker, can the government come to its senses and tell Canadians that they won't impose a streaming tax, as the NDP and Liberal backbenchers are calling for? The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, let's be clear. The government will not be putting on an Internet tax. We have always been clear on that. Since our government took power, we have increased taxes for the wealthiest. We have reduced taxes for the middle class. Canadians from all walks of life use Internet for their businesses and for personal use, and we will not be putting in place a tax that will disadvantage them. The Honourable Member for Richmond-Arthabaska. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister authorized the sale of a company that makes equipment that is used to ensure our security and that of the Americans without a national security review. Now, we're not the only ones who are concerned. The Americans are too. Mr. Speaker, can the Prime Minister finally tell us once and for all if if he spoke to American elected officials and what he talked to them about when it comes to this transaction. The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, national security is an absolute priority for our government. All transactions under the Investment Canada Act are subject to a review and process, which is a multi-step process. We have never compromised national security. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable Member for Belleuil-Chambly. Mr. Speaker, the Liberals left Bill C-51, the former Bill C-51, intact for almost 2 years, despite serious concerns about its constitutionality. Nothing on the no-fly list, nothing on the huge powers given to the intelligence services, just to name a few. There are serious violations of Canadians' privacy, and they voted in favor of that bill. So my question is clear. Will they finally repeal Bill C-51 with the legislation that they plan to table next week?
The Minister of Public Safety.
Mr. Speaker, I've been very clear that following the most extensive consultation with Canadians in Canadian history on the issue of national security and intelligence activities, we will be introducing important legislation. That legislation will accomplish two things. It will make sure that our agencies are keeping Canadians safe, and that legislation will also safeguard Canadian rights and freedoms.
Mr. Speaker, the only action we've seen from these Liberals on C-51 is when they supported the Conservative bill in the last Parliament. And, Mr. Speaker, it's not very reassuring when you're deciding to table legislation in the dying days of a sitting of Parliament. And, Mr. Speaker, it gets worse because we're also looking at warrantless access to the private information of Canadian Internet users, something the Supreme Court has judged is unconstitutional. And so when we look at the Minister's office saying, quote, we're developing proposals for what legislation could look like, that's concerning. Can the Minister assure this House that we're not going to be giving police and spy agencies the powers to take Canadians' private Internet information?
The Minister of Public Safety.
Mr. Speaker, it's a frequent opposition tactic to try to spook people with innuendos and questions. The fact of the matter is, Mr. Speaker, the fact of the matter is the legislation will accomplish the two objectives that I mentioned. Number one, keep Canadians safe. And parallel with that, at exactly the same time, safeguard the rights and freedoms of Canadians, which includes their privacy rights.
The member for Windsor West.
The proposed sale of Norsat to China's Hytera has been botched by this government, a company that is accused of stealing intellectual property and is under investigation in the United States. The Liberals continue to mislead Canadians by saying a security review was done. That is simply not true. U.S. officials raised the alarm, experts in the field recommend a review, and this government hasn't said anything about protecting Canadian jobs here. So why is this government misleading Canadians instead of admitting what they should have done in the first place? Order a formal security review. Do your job.
Honourable Minister of Economic Development.
Mr. Speaker, since the member opposite wants to talk about jobs, let's take the opportunity of this government's investment in Windsor. When we were in Windsor through the Strategic Investment Fund and the Automotive Innovation Fund, Ford Motor Company of Canada invested $1 billion, Mr. Speaker. That would help the city of Windsor and create up to 800 jobs in Windsor and in Ottawa at the Connectivity Centre. These are the kind of investments that are coming under the Investment Canada Act as we go out there explaining to the world that we're open for investment, open for trade, and making sure that we're open to people. We're going to focus on growth, we're going to focus on the middle class and those working hard to join it.
The Honourable Member for Rosemont-la-Petite-Patrie. Because of a legislative change, thousands, or hundreds rather, of employees at Avios lost their jobs, and because Air Canada waited 11 months before compensating them, those workers now owe thousands of dollars to EI. This is the case of Annie Belmar. Her husband lost his job at Avios. 2 years later, he died of cancer. Today, EI is clawing back $11,500 from Ms. Belmar. If nothing's done, she'll have to dip into the education fund for their 3 kids. More than 700 people are in absurd situations like this. Can the Minister show some compassion and resolve these cases? The Honourable Minister. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We are always sad to hear stories like this in the House where people face difficult situations. EI is there to help those people. I would like to ask the honourable member to share with my office any information he has so that we can ensure that the proper situation is carried out. The honourable member. Mr. Speaker, since the Norsat situation arose, what we're seeing is that Canadian diplomacy is facing difficulties here. Yesterday at the Senate committee, the Canadian ambassador to the U.S. confirmed, and I quote, that he thought that the Americans had been consulted, but then he retracted those remarks and said, I don't know anything more than what the Prime Minister said during question period. Can the Minister finally set the record straight for Canadians on this important issue?
Sure.
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the record is very clear. Under the Investment Canada Act, all transactions are subject to a national security review. We have enormous confidence in our national security agencies and the advice that they give us. And the advice that they gave us is the advice that we followed, Mr. Speaker. We never have and never will compromise on national security. The member opposite is creating allegations, innuendo. We're focused on growing the economy. We're focused on the middle class. We're focused on making sure those working hard to join the middle class have every opportunity to succeed.
The Honourable Member for Louis Saint-Laurent. Well, what's clear is that the company has confirmed that it's never undergone a review, and what's clear is that CSIS has stated that, Cabinet made the decision. And the U.S. is concerned about their national security and national security here. When will the government set the record straight on this important issue? The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, you know what is clear? It is clear that Canada's national security agencies examine the deal. You know what else is clear, Mr. Speaker? That the government followed the security agencies' recommendations. Those are the facts. Our security agencies have all the relevant information. They did their due diligence. They did the homework. They followed the process. They made a recommendation, and we accepted that recommendation and that advice. That is how the process works under the Investment Canada Act. We've always followed the process. We've done our homework, Mr. Speaker, and we always will advance Canada's national interest.
The honourable member for Haldimand Norfolk.
Well, Mr. Speaker, under the previous government, we launched a full national security review into the sale of military-grade technology to China. It warned that if approved, China could produce Western military technology, significantly reducing our and our allies' military advantage. Right. Now, with the Norsat sale, this Liberal minister has completely ignored that warning, putting Canadians and our allies' security at risk. Mr. Speaker, when will the minister stop buddying up with China and start standing up for Canadians and our allies?
Hear, hear, right?
Minister of Innovation.
Mr. Speaker, we're always focused on advancing our national interest. That is why we listen to the advice and feedback given by our national security agencies. They examine all the relevant facts. They actually have access to all the relevant facts. They also engage with our allies as well, Mr. Speaker. And in doing so, they make a recommendation to us. And based on that recommendation, we agreed with their assessment. We took their advice. We followed their advice because we understand it's always important to make sure that we advance our national interest and never compromise on national security.
For Haldimand Norfolk.
Well, Mr. Speaker, it's clear that the Liberals didn't do their homework when approving the sale of Norsat to Hytera Communications from China, because Hytera is currently being sued by Motorola for committing massive intellectual property theft. And protection of IP rights is crucial for successful innovation. So my question to the minister is simple. How can we believe that the Liberals are sincere about wanting to promote innovation when they go ahead and approve the sale of Norsat to a Chinese company that has been accused of stealing intellectual property rights?
Honourable Minister of Innovation.
Mr. Speaker, we've been very clear that we respect our national security agencies. We respect the capacity that they have to do their due diligence, to be able to examine all the relevant facts, and to make sure they advance our national interest. And they did exactly that. They followed the process. They made a recommendation to myself. Based on that recommendation, we followed their advice and proceeded with the transaction. We've been very clear. We've been very transparent with Canadians. There's a clear process. We followed it under the Investment Canada Act, and we will always advance our national interest, Mr. Speaker.
The member for Chilliwack Hope.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the sell-off of BC-based Norsat to China-based Hytera raises significant national security concerns here in Canada and with our closest ally, the United States. Norsat is developing military technology for drones and F-35 fighter jets, and putting it in the hands of the Chinese military is a betrayal. We know that the Prime Minister is an admirer of the communist dictatorship of the People's Republic of China, but how can he possibly justify selling out our national security for these 30 pieces of silver?
Honourable Minister of Innovation.
Mr. Speaker, let me be absolutely clear. We never have and we never will compromise on national security. You know why, Mr. Speaker? Because we listen to the advice of our national security agencies. They have the ability to examine all the relevant information, all the relevant facts. They examine the situation very thoroughly. They made a recommendation. They gave us advice. We followed that advice, Mr. Speaker. We never have and we never will compromise on national security.
Order. I would ask the member for Vital River Crowfoot and others to try to restrain themselves and listen to what people say during the question period. And let's listen now to the member for Chilliwack Hope.
Mr. Speaker, the honourable member already has compromised national security. Norsat is a world leader in portable satellite communications terminals with customers that include the U.S. Marine Corps and the U.S. Army, allowing the transfer of such advanced military technology to Hytera, a company already accused of stealing proprietary technology from the West, jeopardizes the national security of Canada and our allies. Such a deal demands a full, formal national security review. Will the Prime Minister order such a review on this deal, or is he more concerned with pleasing his Chinese friends and backers than protecting the national security of Canadians?
Minister of Innovation.
Mr. Speaker, I don't know why the member opposite is attacking our national security agencies. We have full faith in our agencies. We understand that they have the capability, the resources to do the appropriate job. We understand that they are always going to advance our national interests. I don't know why the members opposite continue to attack our national security agencies. We have full confidence in them. That is why we followed their advice, and that is why we proceeded with the transaction, because we support our civil service and we support our national security agencies.
Honourable member for Disnethi, Missinippi, Churchill River. Order.
The Ontario Superior Court found Canada liable for failing to protect survivors of the 60 scoop. When the NDP stood in this House and asked the minister to uphold the judgment, she said, quote, "We will not be appealing." And the Liberals would resolve this, quote, as quickly as possible. 4 months later, and government lawyers are stopping the case from moving into the next phase. So why, despite all their talking points, are Liberals still fighting Indigenous people in court?
The Minister of Indigenous and Northern Affairs.
Taking action on the outstanding childhood claim, and I have a mandate to negotiate with all 60 scoop plaintiffs. As the courts have clearly laid out, no two experiences are the same, no two voices are identical. We believe that each individual deserves the justice they're entitled to. This goes beyond what the courts can prescribe, with revitalizing and restoring language and culture through community programs. Resolving these cases is an important step in our journey of reconciliation with Indigenous peoples.
The Honourable Member for.
Indigenous children were taken from their parents and placed within non-Indigenous families. They were denied their rights and stripped of their identity. When the court ruled in their favour, the Minister of Indigenous Affairs said she would never appeal, and many felt redeemed, Mr. Speaker. Now the Minister of Justice continues to deny those survivors justice by appealing this decision, while she withdraw her appeal and repair the serious breach of human rights against these survivors. There cannot be no reconciliation in this country, Mr. Speaker, in the absence of justice.
Honourable Minister of Indigenous and Northern Affairs.
Monsieur le Président.
Mr. Speaker, I am not interested in going back to court on this file. Instead, we have the mandate to negotiate, and that is what we want to do. Let's be clear. The government is resolved to work with First Nations to resolve this issue. That is why we have already launched negotiations with a view to concluding a settlement at the national level for the 60 scoop. the negotiations will make it possible for all parties to work together with a view to providing a solution to this situation.
White Rock.
In an interview, the Prime Minister's special advisor on the Infrastructure Bank was asked how would the bank protect taxpayers from high user fees imposed by private investors. He replied, that's not the role of the bank. When asked how will the bank protect taxpayers if an investor abandons the project or defaults, he said, I don't really understand how it's an issue. If it's not the role of the bank to protect taxpayers and the Prime Minister's special advisor doesn't even understand why taxpayers need to be protected, how can the Liberals continue to support the development of the bank?
Honourable Minister of Infrastructure and Communities.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we put forward a very ambitious agenda to build and rebuild Canadian communities, and Infrastructure Bank will allow us to do that. And today, Mr. Speaker, we made $1.2 billion investment in the province of Quebec to build Montreal's public transit system that will create 34,000 jobs, Mr. Speaker. And our partnership with the province of Quebec and the leadership of Quebec, our Quebec caucus, is achieving tangible and real results for Quebec. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Mégantic-Clairac. Mr. Speaker, on the Infrastructure Bank file, the government is once again showing how arrogant it is. Neither House has finished studying C-44, and the position of the bank president's been posted. And today, the Prime Minister has said that a bank that doesn't exist yet could potentially invest $1.3 billion in Quebec. And I think it's time to take a step back, Mr. Speaker. Will the Prime Minister finally allow parliamentarians to speak on this bank for Liberal friends, and will it split this off Bill C-44?
Let me state this again, Mr. Speaker, how proud we are about our partnership with the province of Quebec and the City of Montreal to support this project. That's one of the largest infrastructure projects, largest public transit projects in the recent history of City of Montreal. I'm so proud to be working with my Quebec MPs to have this project become a reality so we can keep on building the infrastructure that our communities need. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Foothills. Order.
Mr. Speaker, in 16 days, Canada will turn 150 years old, and Canadians will be celebrating across the country with friends and family. And many of those celebrations will include some of the world's best beer, wine, and spirits, made right here in Canada. Unfortunately, the Liberals are looking at this as an opportunity to increase taxes on Canadians. This year and every year after, the Liberals will be increasing taxes on beer, wine, and spirits. Can the Minister please explain why the Liberals are so intent to tax the fun out of Canada Day?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Finance.
It's always a pleasure to rise in this House and to speak about the good work that our government has been doing. Our government's first action that we took when we formed government was increase taxes on the wealthiest 1% so that we can lower them for middle-class Canadians. We've also introduced a Canada Child Benefit Program that has lifted hundreds of thousands of children out of poverty. Mr. Speaker, we are moving ahead with our plan to provide fairness, grow the economy, and strengthen the middle class by creating jobs and giving people the skills that they need for the economy of tomorrow. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Foothills.
Well, Mr. Speaker, whoever came up with that answer and whoever proposed a never-ending tax hike was certainly drinking something.
Or smoking something.
In fact, our Canadian craft alcohol producers are already on the hook to pay some of the highest taxes in the world. In fact, an escalating tax was tried once before by the previous Trudeau government. It failed miserably. Many businesses closed, costing us thousands of jobs. It's not too late for the minister to put this policy in the drunk tank. Will they stand up for our Canadian craft alcohol producers, the thousands of jobs they create? Will they cork this tax?
Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, we know that when we have an economy that works for the middle class, we have an economy that works for Canada as a whole. Our government has cut taxes for 9 million middle-class Canadians, Mr. Speaker. We have introduced a Canada Child Benefit Program that has lifted hundreds of thousands of children out of poverty. Mr. Speaker, our plan is working, we're moving forward, and we will continue working for Canadians. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Order. Alors, l'honorable député de...
The honourable member for Saint-Hyacinthe-Bagotte. In 2006, this government cut funding by 33% to organizations caring for people living with HIV all across Canada. In April, the Minister of Health said in committee she had cancelled the cuts by putting $30 million in new money into the federal initiative on HIV. But strangely, her deputy minister later said that the minister had misspoken. Why is the minister so muddled when it comes to her own department? And is she going to cancel the cuts to these organizations, yes or no? The Honourable Health Minister.
This question. Responding to the needs of people affected by HIV and preventing new HIV infections is something that's very important to us. We did, in fact, put new investments in the budget. There will be an additional $35 million into the Canadian Federal Initiative on HIV and hepatitis C prevention. That's in addition to the money that we're putting through the First Nations and Inuit Health Branch to also prevent new infections and treat those already affected by HIV. We will work through the Public Health Agency of Canada to address the needs of Canadians affected by HIV.
Honourable member for Vancouver Kingsway.
Mr. Speaker, I have in front of me the department spending documents that prove there isn't a single extra dime in extra funding for the Federal Initiative on HIV. These documents prove there isn't an extra nickel for the Community Action Fund, the very program that funds the groups providing HIV care. The minister stated that she secured, and I quote, investments in the budget to expand the Federal Initiative on HIV of $30 million of new funding. This is demonstrably false, so will she apologize to the organizations she misled?
Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, I will be very happy at some point to sit down with the member opposite and clarify to him that, in fact, the Federal Initiative on HIV/AIDS is expanding in the order of over $30 million. I have been speaking with the Public Health Agency of Canada. We are making sure that good community organizations are going to get expansion to the programs and continue those good programs. We're also expanding programs like the Know Your Status program in Saskatchewan that has demonstrably decreased the rates of new infections. We will work with those agencies to make sure we protect Canadians.
The honourable member for Pierrefonds-Dollard. Mr. Speaker, Canadians understand the importance of transportation when it comes to reliable and efficient commuting to work, visiting friends or family, or getting back home after a long day. In the Greater Montreal area, it's important, more important than ever, to have a world-class public transit system so that our city can prosper. Can the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Infrastructure and Communities tell us how the government supports the expansion of public transit in Montreal? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank the member for Pierrefonds-Dollard for his question. Today, I was proud to be beside the Prime Minister in Montreal, where he announced an investment of $1.3 billion by the federal government in the REM network in Montreal. This investment will create jobs for the middle class and support a modern and efficient public transit system for Montrealers and people in the area. It will cut commuting times and allow them to spend more time with their families. I'd like to thank the Quebec Liberal Caucus for their involvement in this file. Long live Montreal.
Member for Barrie Innisfil.
Mr. Speaker, the Innovation Minister assured this House the government had done their due diligence regarding the billion-dollar Chinese takeover by Ongbong Insurance of seniors' homes in British Columbia. Ongbong is built on risky investments, controlling over $250 billion in assets worldwide. The minister claimed he had done his homework and there was no reason for Canadians to be concerned. But now, with the imprisonment of the company chairman on allegations of corruption and the ownership of Ongbong's assets now in question, does the minister still think that this is a good idea?
Honourable Minister of Innovation.
Mr. Speaker, as the Prime Minister reiterated yesterday, BC, British Columbia, has a strong, robust regulatory regime and it imposes rigorous standards on care on operators, Mr. Speaker. Under the Investment Canada Act, when we reviewed it, we made sure that we were able to obtain strong commitments on employment levels, and more importantly, we wanted Cedar Tree to have the additional financial resources to create more jobs and more growth in British Columbia, Mr. Speaker. Like I said before, we're focused on growth and jobs, and that's how we did our analysis under the net benefit process.
Honourable member for Barrie Innisfil.
Gotta love that, Cedar Tree. I love that. Hey, the chairman of Ombong, Wu Zhihua, was escorted by police out of his office last week, and no one knows where he is. Mr. Wu is the company's mastermind, and 92% of Ombong is owned by him or his relatives. With Wu's arrest, the Chinese regime could seize control of seniors' care facilities in BC. Mr. Speaker, what does the minister say to BC seniors who may end up with the People's Republic of China as their new landlord, and why did he put Liberal Party interests ahead of vulnerable Canadian seniors?
Minister of Immigration.
Mr. Speaker, when it comes to vulnerable seniors, our government understands the importance of investing in them. That is why we increased the guaranteed income supplement for seniors. That is why we changed the old age security levels from 67 to 65, Mr. Speaker. That is why we're focusing on investing in seniors. With respect to the specific transactions, we did our due diligence, we followed the process. It was done under the Investment Canada Act, Mr. Speaker, and with regards to the regulatory requirements, British Columbia is responsible for that, and they're overseeing that process. Yes.
Far too much noise. Honourable member Caribou, Prince George.
Mr. Speaker, the only thing that this minister has done is sold our seniors down the road. Mr. Speaker, once again we find ourselves talking about the Liberals' open, transparent, merit-based appointment process. We know that the Halifax Port Authority, 5 of the 7 board members are appointed by the federal government. Can you guess what all 5 Liberal appointed board members have in common? Every single one of them is a Liberal donor. The evidence is overwhelming. Will the Prime Minister finally admit that when it comes to appointments, only Liberals need apply?
Honourable Minister of Transport.
Mr. Speaker, I totally reject the premise of that question. We have always been very clear that in our new, open, transparent, merit-based process that also looks at diversity, including gender diversity, that we are looking for the best and most qualified people to occupy these important positions in our port authorities. And I'm very proud of the selection that we have made for the fine port of Halifax.
Order. It's not appropriate to keep on bellowing and heckling throughout the answer to a question, so we're going to go on. The honourable member for Nanaimo Ladysmith.
Violence against women in the Northwest Territories was 9 times the national rate, according to StatsCan. 80% of Northwest Territories communities don't have access to victim services. 85% don't have domestic violence shelters, and some women don't even have access to phones. If this self-described feminist government truly believes in equality and ending violence against women, how will Liberals ensure every woman has support? No woman is ever turned away from a shelter, no matter where she lives.
For the status of women.
Mr. Speaker, I thank my honourable colleague for her question and for her advocacy. I can assure her that not only do we put gender at the heart of the work that we do, no relationship is more important to our government than that with First Nations, Inuit and the Métis peoples of this land. To that end, Mr. Speaker, we will very soon be announcing the gender-based violence strategy, which aims to do exactly what the member opposite wishes for it to do. Thanks to the committee for their work. This morning, we announced a significant investment in an organization that will be doing great work in northern communities across our country.
No, member for Salaberry-sur-Loire. The saga of the Catherine Spirit is getting to be a real farce, and the Liberals are making taxpayers pay for their mismanagement. The Transport Minister said in November 2016 that work would start after a call for tenders in the spring of 2017. It's now mid-June and still nothing. What's worse, according to the Journal de Montréal, work won't start till 2018 and finish perhaps by 2019. Will ministers quit jerking around the people of Beauharnois? Will they agree to meet with the mayor and me next week to give us an update on the situation? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Mr. Speaker, our government committed to protect the health and safety of Canadians as well as our water. We're taking all necessary steps to ensure that the ship in question is permanently removed in an efficient and safe way. Between June of last year and June of this year, a number of assessments were conducted. Proposals will be publicly advertised, call for tenders this summer, and the work should begin in the fall. Thank you.
An explosive report shows that in the last 18 months, Canada has seen a massive spike in asylum claims that will cost taxpayers a staggering $2.97 billion in welfare payments that have not been budgeted for. By doing things like lifting the Mexican visa requirement and turning a blind eye to the illegal border crossing crisis, the Liberals have created a huge processing backlog, failing both taxpayers and the world's most vulnerable alike. How is the Prime Minister going to pay for his #Welcome to Canada, #fail?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Immigration Minister. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Once again, I'm very proud of our government's commitment to shelter those fleeing war and violence. The Commission recently announced new steps like more robust hearings that will lead to more productivity and more security for claimants. We plan to do more to speed up the processing of asylum claims. We'll be working together to make sure that our refugee system is robust, fair, and efficient. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, the air and land blockade of Qatar by Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states is continuing. Saudi Arabia cites Qatari links with militant groups in the embrace of various terrorist entities, including Iranian groups. And Saudi Arabia is demanding that Qatar break all links with the Muslim Brotherhood, Hamas, and Iran. Now, Mr. Speaker, Canadians haven't heard a peep from the Liberals on this dispute, which includes both allies and enemies. Can the Minister explain why?
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Foreign Affairs.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The stability of the Gulf Cooperation Council and the broader Middle East is certainly of importance to this government and to all Canadians. Canada is following recent developments in the region. We strongly encourage all parties to work together to resolve disagreements. Canada's consular travel advice has been updated to reflect the ongoing situation, and we are advising travellers to exercise a high degree of caution. We hope that issues between the parties will be addressed in a constructive manner. Thank you.
Member for Brandon Souris.
Mr. Speaker, today another two cases of the deadly PED virus have been reported in Manitoba hog barns, yet the Minister of Agriculture has offered nothing more than bafflegab. More talk, Mr. Speaker. This morning we heard from industry pork experts that the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, at the very least, needs to immediately bring back the biosecurity measures the Liberals eliminated, particularly the trusted truck wash protocol. Will the Minister finally listen to these industry experts and stop needlessly putting these Canadian farm families at risk?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Mr. Speaker, we're determined to protect animal health in Canada. We're working with our partners to ensure that this illness is contained. Our government is supporting Manitoba in its efforts to manage the current PED outbreak, and we will continue to do so. We want to ensure that we have a very effective transportation protocol to protect livestock. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Humber River Black Creek.
Mr. Speaker, late payment of contractors in the construction industry for far too long has been a significant problem. Contractors who complete their obligations deserve to be paid in a timely manner.
Sure.
Too many workers and small businesses in the construction industry face severe hardship while they wait for payment of their work. Can the Parliamentary Secretary please inform this House of recent steps taken to ensure the prompt payment to these contractors?
Good question.
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
We have very good news today, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the honourable member from Humber River Black Creek for her hard work on this file. Our government strongly supports the prompt payment of contractors and subcontractors, and last week we were able to announce that we will publicly disclose payments to contractors to eliminate this unfair situation. This will provide our subcontractors with the information they need to get paid on time, and of course, along with the honourable member, we will continue to work with our industry partners to find further tangible solutions to bring prompt payment fairness to our trade workers and businesses. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Charlebourg, Haute-Saint-Charles. Mr. Speaker, the official announcement of the University Vocation of Saint-Jean Military College is long overdue. The first student cohort is slated to get started this fall. Military officials are frustrated by all the delays. Can the Defence Minister confirm the number of announcements that have been cancelled over the past 18 months? And secondly, whether any university students will actually be in the classroom this fall? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Mr. Speaker, if my colleague read the new defence policy, it's there in black and white. The reopening of the Saint-Jean Military College, University College, it's good news, and this has had its effect. Many students have enrolled in the curriculum and will be able to continue their university studies at the Saint-Jean Military College.
Mr. Speaker, Churchill, Manitoba is facing a crisis. Almost a year ago, the port was shut down, and now it's the rail line. The community is suddenly isolated. Businesses are hurting. People are worried. We need immediate federal action. What Churchill is facing is a national disgrace. Our North deserves better. So will the federal government step in to address the immediate crisis and finally work to renationalize the port and the rail line and work with Northern and Indigenous communities to get it working again?
Honourable Minister of Transport.
Speaker, we, as the government, always stand ready to provide assistance to any province or territory that requests assistance in the event of a natural disaster such as flooding, and the Minister of Public Safety has been in contact with the Government of Manitoba to make that offer clear to them, and we're monitoring the situation. And from the Transport Canada point of view, we are developing a plan to make sure that both the Port of Churchill and the airport are capable of addressing the needs with respect to resupply for the people of Churchill.
Member for Vaughan Woodbridge.
Mr. Speaker, the previous government used every opportunity to attack middle-class Canadians who are part of unions in this country. They undermined the collective bargaining process and made it more difficult for Canadian workers to organize. The
previous government considered unions an obstacle, but our government sees them as partners in building a strong economy with good jobs.
Employment. Provide this House with an update on measures this government has taken to support the labour movement at home and abroad.
Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank the member from Vaughan Woodbridge for his question and his work on behalf of Canadian unions. Mr. Speaker, this week was a great week for Canadian labour and for Canadian workers. Yesterday, the Senate passed Bill C-4, an act that repeals two Conservative bills that were both egregious and deliberate attacks on organized labour. As well, Mr. Speaker, our minister ratified ILO Convention 98, a bill that guarantees, an act that guarantees workers' rights to organize and bargain collectively. This government ran on a platform of fair and balanced labour laws, and we will deliver that to Canadian workers.
The honourable member. The honourable member for Montmagny-Lillet, Kamouraska, Rivière-du-Loup. Mr. Speaker, yesterday the Heritage Minister claimed that she was part of an exemplary government that shows the way towards respect for official languages. If that's true, how does she explain the fact that complaints to the Official Languages Commissioner have shot up by 40% over the past year, and that her colleague, the Environment Minister, sent me a letter yesterday in English only to my office here in Ottawa about my riding, which is one of the most francophone ridings in the country? Could the Liberals spend less time appointing their cronies to high office? The Honourable Minister of Canadian Heritage. Obviously, official languages are a priority for this government. When it comes to bilingualism, we're always striving to do better. We have an official languages commissioner. We will respect the process for appointing the next one. It's an important process, and that, of course, is a priority in terms of our government-wide approach. I'd like to remind my colleague that we've already taken action on this in areas of defense, justice, infrastructure, and so on, and I would encourage my colleague to take part in our consultations. The honourable member for Repentigny. Mr. Speaker, all of Quebec's TV stakeholders, the actors, technicians, directors, screenplay writers, producers, in short, Mr. Speaker, the entire industry in Quebec is calling on the minister to reverse the CRTC's decisions of May 17th. The Heritage Minister has the power to do that by law, but is she willing to? Is the Heritage Minister going to turn her back on Quebec TV or stand up in the face of this attack on our culture? The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to remind my colleague how important, how significant our investment in culture has been. $9 billion in Budget 2016 is the largest investment in 30 years. We're the only G7 country to invest so much. And when it comes to the stakeholders in the creative industries, the CRTC has now ruled. There's legislation in place that allows for recourse, and so I will await. I'd like to take the time that I now have available to me to listen to stakeholders. The honourable member for Joliette. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That's very disappointing for our artists. After multiple constitutional experts and a unanimous motion of the National Assembly, now it's the UPA's turn to call on members of the House of Commons. Their demand is simple. Split Bill C-44 so that the Infrastructure Bank becomes subject to Quebec law, including legislation that protects farmland. Will this government, who ignores our National Assembly, listen to Quebec's farmers, yes or no?
Mr. Speaker, as often I have assured this House and the honourable member that any project undertaken by the Canada Infrastructure Bank will have to abide by all the rules and regulations of every province and municipality, and we will work very closely with the province to ensure that's exactly what happens. The role of the bank is to actually build infrastructure in partnership with provinces and municipalities, and we will respect local jurisdiction.